Matt's dissertation includes a multinational examination of social, economic, and environmental determinants of household air pollution, concentrations, and factors that contribute to households' transition from polluting to clean cooking fuels in low-income countries. Matt is studying these determinants in the context of the prospective urban and rural epidemiology, PURE, household air pollution study. The exposures developed from Matt's thesis will ultimately be used in epidemiological analyses to estimate the cardiovascular respiratory health burden of cooking with polluting fuels on a global scale. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Matt Shupler.
Thank you for the introduction. Can everyone hear me? Just a little bit. It's okay? Okay, good. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to present. So as was mentioned, I'm going to present on some of my dissertation research on household air pollution. So first, what is household air pollution? When we refer to this type of air pollution, it normally occurs in the household from cooking primarily, but also from heating and lighting. And so they're cooking with what we call polluting fuels, so not anything except what we're used to cooking here with gas or electrics. Those we consider clean fuels. But in lower income countries, they can cook with wood, animal dung, coal, charcoal, any type of biomass that's locally available. And they'll cook this in their household usually, so you can imagine like a campfire in your household every day. And the high concentrations from the inefficient stoves, often with poor ventilation, no fans or sometimes no chimneys, and so that high exposure on a daily basis is very adversely affects your health. In addition to the exposures from the air pollution itself, we also consider other aspects, including gathering the fuel wood. This task typically falls among women and sometimes children who have to travel a long distance to collect the fuel wood. So that takes away valuable time if they're traveling a couple hours every day to collect this fuel wood. And in some cases, they can be subject to violence along these routes if they're not safe. So we also consider in some studies the other components of time and travel. So where is household air pollution the biggest problem? We say it's a global issue because it still affects about 40% of the population, most predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and to a lesser extent in Central and South America. So when we talk about improving access to clean cooking, this map on the left is a projection of the percent of the population in each continent or area that's expected to have access to clean fuels. And the good news is that across the board it's increasing. However, the global population is also increasing. And so in order for us to severely decrease the amount of people exposed to household air pollution, we have to make sure that access to clean fuels outpaces that of population growth. Sometimes we refer to accelerating access to clean fuels. So for example, looking at sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that the proportion is increasing from about now to 20% to 40%. However, due to rapid population growth, the actual total absolute number of people is expected to grow between now and 2030. So the major goal is to ultimately improve this so that it's outpacing population growth. And eventually one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is to provide universal access to clean cooking fuels. Some of you may be familiar with the Global Burden of Disease study. So this study is done annually and seeks to rank different risk factors according to mortality and ill health. And so this figure here is listing environmental risk factors, and it's ranking them by DALYs, which is at the bottom, stands for Disability Adjusted Life Years. And that's a metric that's calculated using years of healthy life lost. And so this is how we can compare across different risk factors and rank them according to their burden. And you can see from this list that household air pollution is ranked third. And on the right, it describes what those adverse health outcomes are. And for household air pollution, we typically think of respiratory conditions, which can be chronic conditions like COPD and lung cancer, as well as infections, so pneumonia and tuberculosis. And then some of you may not be familiar or as familiar with cardiovascular diseases. So there's been studies linking air pollution to stroke, heart attack, heart failure, and those contribute to a significant burden as well. There's been a lot of epidemiological evidence studying the health effects of household air pollution. So I've included here some systematic reviews. So some of the outcomes I just mentioned, cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, as well as adverse pregnancy outcomes, so low birth weight, etc. There's been many studies on that as well. So when we talk about household air pollution, how would we measure these exposures in an epidemiological study? So some of you may be familiar with particulate matter, PM 2.5, and this refers to particulates that are less than 2.5 micrometers. And the reason why we focus on this particular particle, which you can't actually see, it's very small, so compared to the width of human hair, it's much smaller than that. And PM 2.5 is measured because they can actually travel deeper into your lungs, whereas other particles wouldn't make it that far. And when it travels into your lungs, that's where it can cause the severe health effects and respiratory conditions, as well as crossing over into your bloodstream and then cardiovascular impacts as well. So this is the most common metric used in epidemiological studies. The PURE study is the study framework that I'll be describing today. So this study began in 2003. It's a multinational study, and so they're looking at effects of urbanization and development on health in general. And so this PURE study collected multiple information across a variety of disciplines. So they collected community environmental aspects, and so they collected things such as walkability score, and then looking into household characteristics, so household questionnaire on family structure, socioeconomic status, as well as other behaviors linked to health. So we think of smoking, nutrition, physical activity, and then also health outcomes. And this is a larger study that was collected among over 200,000 participants in 25 countries. So this is a large-scale cohort study. The follow-up is still going on. And the sampling was done within countries, and then selected within those countries are certain cities, or what are referred to as centers, and then different rural and urban communities. So clustered sampling within these different countries. Here is an example of the Household Questionnaire. And this questionnaire was administered at baseline and during a follow-up period. And an important question in this questionnaire was the type of primary fuel used. So we can look at what they indicate at baseline and what they indicate at follow-up. And we have this for 200,000 people. And focusing on countries in PURE, so I said there's 25 countries, but there was 9 where the use of polluting fuels at baseline was very prevalent. And these are the 9 countries here. So you can see the list of polluting fuels on the right. And so in the countries of Zimbabwe, Pakistan, and Tanzania, it was almost 100%. So at baseline, which is approximately around 2003, in the rural communities of these countries, it was almost exclusive use of polluting fuels, so no use of gas and electricity. Another component that I mentioned is collected in the PURE study is health outcome data, and we're focusing on cardiovascular disease and respiratory diseases. And so the follow-up has been going on for at least 9 years in the cohort. And in low-income and low-middle-income countries, part of the issue is having a standardized way to collect this data. So they don't have as comprehensive registries as we may have here in Canada. And so there's effort made to conduct interviews, either face-to-face, via telephone, and at least every 3 years, and checking hospital records, as well as certification of death and sometimes autopsies. So these are methods used by members of the PURE study, and we're looking at characterizing or linking these events to the use of polluting versus clean fuels. And again, the cardiovascular and respiratory diseases are listed below, and these are the events we were looking at to collect. So looking at the health effects associated with polluting fuel use in Pure. So in this particular analysis, which was recently published, we're just looking at a binary exposure. So again, in those countries that I listed previously with the high use of polluting fuels, looking at those using polluting fuels versus clean fuels at baseline, and then looking at the follow-up data and seeing how the use of polluting versus clean fuels can impact your risk for CVD and respiratory diseases. So hazard ratios were conducted, looking at incidence during the follow-up period. You can see here I've grouped different outcomes. So we have all-cause mortality, so from all events, CVD and respiratory disease combined, as well as fatal, non-fatal CVD, and the same for respiratory disease. And you can see that there is a significant relationship among all-cause mortality, marginally significant for CVD as well, and also marginally significant for respiratory disease. And so this is the effect that polluting fuels can have while adjusting for all these covariates that you would originally control for. So your standard smoking, physical activity, nutrition, and other SES factors that we would traditionally think are associated with these outcomes. And so I previously showed the baseline levels of polluting fuel use. And so looking at the difference between baseline and follow-up, because I said that same household questionnaire was administered during both, we actually found that approximately half of the households that reported using polluting fuels at baseline actually switched fuels between baseline and follow-up. And I have the breakdown here of the type of switch. So polluting to clean fuels means they had a polluting fuel at baseline, but then at follow-up they reported use of a clean fuel. So that's what we want to see. However, that was not the only case. So that was 30%. However, there were some where they actually reported a cleaning fuel at baseline, but then follow-up it was a polluting fuel. So that's kind of reverse switching. And there was also switching within clean to clean. So think of gas to electric or vice versa, and then within different types of polluting fuels. So maybe wood to animal dung or coal to wood, etc. And this is important because when we think of fuel switching, we just think, okay, everyone's just improving over time, they're getting access to clean fuels. But what this shows that's not always the case, that sometimes the clean fuel that they once had may not be available and they're forced to switch. So that's something to consider when we think about access to these fuels. It's not always just a one-time switch and then you're using clean fuels constantly. Here's a picture I found, not from the Pure study, but a different study that you can see, it might be hard to see, but this is actually an LPG cylinder. And they are not using that anymore, and actually creatively are using this as a wood stove, and they're actually feeding in wood through this gas cylinder to actually cook their food. And so that's an example, perhaps, of reverse switching, right? They were using this LPG stove, they had access to it, and then they no longer did, and so now they converted that to a wood stove. So this may be the reality for some households, and I think sometimes that may be overlooked. So then breaking the fuel switching by country. So you can see that it actually varied a lot by country and how the percentage of the Pure households that switched. So for example, China and India had some of the highest rates of switching. So if you can see in the dark green, these are the clean fuels in green, access to gas pretty much doubled in China and India, around 25 to 50% or so, and in India even a higher percent increase. Whereas in other countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, as well as some of the African countries, Tanzania and Zimbabwe, it was very similar. And so the switching occurred more heavily in countries like India and China, and also South Africa. And so one of the goals is to look at, okay, we know it's differential across countries, so what's causing this difference between countries and switching? So looking at all 9 countries that I listed, we calculated odds ratios of looking at the odds of switching to from polluting to clean fuels for certain characteristics. And so we have community level factors as well as household level factors. And so this shows that across the 9 countries, that community level factors actually played a larger role. So for example, increase in population density between 2005 and 2015, which roughly covers the follow-up period, as well as the overall population density at the midpoint in 2010, were significantly associated with switching from a polluting to a clean fuel. So we think those may be proxies for better access to clean fuels. If they're in a highly densely populated area, they may be more likely to have access to these fuels because there's higher demand and a better supply chain, etc. And then also considering household factors, so the household size, education level, home asset index, which is an index of the number of assets you may have, like televisions, etc. So kind of a way to standardize wealth across the countries. And this is what has been typically studied in the field in terms of switching, is that if you have higher education, better wealth, right, you have the income and the disposable income to spend money on cleaner fuels versus maybe collecting firewood for free in your local community. But interestingly, that the community level factors seem to actually be more important than these household level factors, saying possibly more importantly, or just as important as your household wealth, you also need access to these fuels, right? You need the actual constant supply to be using this over time. And on this slide, I've showed a comparison of India versus China. So looking at just the most important factors in each. In India, interestingly, household level factors seem to play the largest role in switching, so education and household asset index. Whereas in China, it was more likely to be community level factors, so population density and travel time to closest city. And this may be also a factor of the location of the community. So in India, they may be less sparsely or not as spread out or rural as in China. And so if they are more urban, let's say, then they would not, then the actual education and wealth would play a larger role because access may not be as big of an issue. Whereas in China, if the communities are more rural, then they actually need the supply of the clean fuels. So now reverting back to what I talked about earlier in the presentation was about quantifying PM 2.5 exposure. So I previously reported on analysis looking at the binary of clean versus polluting fuels. But now we want to move into a more accurate quantification of the actual PM 2.5 exposure, because that's how we can differentiate within different types of polluting fuels. Because you can imagine not all exposures from wood in every country is the same. We want to actually measure that and then link that to our health outcomes. So this graph here is showing the relationship between PM 2.5 exposure and the relative risk of, on the left, ischemic heart disease, and on the right, stroke. So this is kind of a mix of different studies, epidemiological studies that have been conducted. And so in this legend, on the left is ambient air pollution, which typically falls in the lower range from, say, 10 to 50 micrograms per meter cubed. So Vancouver is usually like in the 7 to 10 range. And then on the far right side, these are studies of active smoking, so tobacco smoke. And household air pollution would actually fall in the middle between these studies. And what these graphs are showing is that we have a lot of studies historically that have measured the cardiovascular effects of ambient air pollution, so like in urban areas or in developed countries, as well as the pollution from tobacco smoking. But household air pollution exposures typically fall between these two. And so we have a lack of evidence showing exactly what the relative risk is. So this is very important from a population health perspective, because the population exposed to household air pollution is so large, about 40% of the world, as I mentioned earlier. And so whether or not the risk is actually lower, around maybe 1.2, or on the higher end, around 2, that relative risk, when multiplied by 2 billion people has a huge difference on health when we're talking about the global burden of disease. So studies are needed to quantify this relationship and measure these exposures quantitatively with PM 2.5 and link that to health outcomes so we can get an actual better quantitative estimate and improve our global estimation. And so if we think of monitoring these levels in households, we may think, okay, well, we just monitor in certain wood households and certain coal households. Once we get a few samples, we know the exposure range and we're done. However, there are a lot of other factors that can contribute to your concentration or average exposure. And so what the purpose of this graph is to show that within different fuel types, so for example, wood, gas, coal, that there's large variation between countries among the same fuel type. So if someone is exposed to wood fuel in Brazil, that on average would be lower than someone that's exposed to wood fuel in Eastern Africa. And so the important thing is that we want to measure exposures in as many countries as possible so we could characterize their exposures and the health risk. The problem is that conducting these studies and deploying air monitors in these low-income countries is difficult financially, time-wise, getting the resources to measure this and then follow participants over a long period of time to measure their health outcomes. It's not possible to do in every single country. So in addition to, so I just talked about variation. So we want to think about ways or important characteristics of the cooking environment that can describe this variation. So I have pictures here of some of the different countries. You can see the fuel setup. And so you could imagine that using wood in this stove in Chile maybe have a different concentration than using wood in Pakistan with just an open fire. And so considering also the type of stove used, as well as the amount of time that you're cooking on average. So if you're cooking longer meals, spending more time, your concentrations in your kitchen and what you're exposed to would likely be higher. And then other factors of SES, so that may also contribute to your exposure to ambient air pollution. And ambient also plays a role in your overall daily exposures. And so all these need to be considered. So the Pure Air study, so I mentioned the Pure study was this large cohort of over 200,000 people, and so the Pure Air study is nested within this study. And so we added 48-hour PM 2.5 monitoring. So we placed a monitor in kitchens for 48 hours to measure their exposures, to measure the concentrations. And I'll go into more detail in a second about how this actually works. This monitor is called the UPass. And so we conducted kitchen monitoring in 2,500 households, and then within a subset of those households, we also monitored 750 male and female participants because we want to compare concentrations in the kitchen to actual personal exposures, which may be different according to where they're staying during the course of 48 hours. And then we also collected a more comprehensive survey data in addition to the Pure baseline questionnaire. So we added more information on secondary fuels, as well as time cooking, etc. So the study was conducted in 8 countries. Those countries are listed there. And so these are the countries that I previously showed with high level of baseline polluting fuel use. And so our criteria was countries that had greater than 10% of households using polluting fuels at baseline. And so these pictures on the left show the monitor setup in the kitchen. So we place it on a stand and place it a meter away from the stove, and then 1.5 meters up to kind of mimic your breathing zone when you're cooking and also be out of the way. We don't want this to interfere with what they're cooking during the middle of the day. So this was a setup in India and Tanzania. And we also have personal monitoring, which you wear on a harness and you kind of want close to your collarbone or breathing zone. And so they have the option of wearing it on the harness here, as in China and Tanzania, or also an armband. That was in Pakistan, and this is male and female in India. So how does the UPass monitor actually work? So the UPass collects a gravimetric sample, and so this consists of a filter And this filter has a cartridge ID, so we can keep track of where this is. And this is entered in the survey, so we know which filter is used in which household. This filter is placed in the cartridge, and originally this is pre-weighed on a robot, which is here on the right. And so we get the mass of the filter before they actually collect the sample. And this monitor is placed, the filter cartridge is placed inside the UPass. And then after the sampling, once the 48 hours are done, the filters are shipped back to us from the study countries and then post-weighed again. So you can see this is the prior to the sample and after. And these Teflon filters are specifically designed so that they only capture PM2.5 particles. And so we can have the post-weight and the pre-weight, and that difference is the total mass of particles. And then the volume of air that's collected, that's blown through this, the UPass, is our volume of air. And so that gives us a concentration, mass over volume. And the robot is good because it gives us an automated way to measure all these samples. So we have 3,000 samples from the 2,500 household and over 700 personal. So you can imagine doing this by hand would take a long time. You're trying to get this by the closest microgram. And so the robot makes that a lot quicker to analyze. And so in terms of deploying the actual monitor, so the cool thing about these monitors, you actually deploy them from a smartphone, so just like a regular app you can download on an Android phone on the Google Play Store. And this makes deployment a lot faster and easier. And so this is helpful for our study because we're collecting so many different samples. So you would download this app, you have the app on your phone, you connect to the UPass monitor via Bluetooth, you find the UPass ID, and the field workers are able to connect. They program different parameters inside the app. So they program, for example, the cartridge ID. We have some other standard measurements, and then they start the sample, and it says you will be running for 48 hours, and then they're able to leave the monitor there in the kitchen or on the person, and they'll collect it 48 hours later. Once they go back to collect the monitor, the data is stored in the memory card in the UPass. They could actually transfer it to their phone, and then they wirelessly upload it to a server at UBC, and we can instantly collect all the data files. So it's a quick, easy wireless transfer. And once the files are received on the server, I developed an R code to kind of check the data, because a lot of times there can be issues with the monitor shutting off for various reasons. Maybe the monitor wasn't properly charged, maybe something got stuck. We've had issues of bugs getting stuck in the filter. And so the monitor may shut off. And so the code is able to run through these files once they're uploaded, and it runs through once a day, every 24 hours, and can alert me if there's any issues with the files. And so if this is the case, I can then email the different field teams and say, oh, there was an issue with this sample at this household. You should please try to resample that household again. So we can make sure we get the full 48 hours of monitoring. And also, as I mentioned, the robot also sped up the process. There was also remote training of field workers. So as I mentioned, we collected data in 8 different countries. So we weren't able to travel to all those countries. So we made YouTube videos that we can send to them. I think it's easier than them going through a protocol. A lot of times field workers don't like to read long protocols. So sending them a YouTube video may make it easier, especially if they have a certain question. I could just say, go to minute 4 of this YouTube video and you can review this. We did have 98 views there, so it looks like they did watch the video at least. That's a good sign. This YouTube protocol was made by a master's student that graduated from here, Aaron Birch. It's also important to conduct evaluation of the monitors. In our particular study, we were one of the first research groups to use this UPass monitor. And so you want to, test and evaluate the monitor in the field, so before you actually conduct the measurements. And so on the left, we're comparing the UPass to something called a Harvard impactor, which has been used a lot longer. And then you could run a correlation to see how close the monitors are, if they're placed side by side, how well the UPass performs. You can see from this graph it performed pretty well with an R squared of 0.9. And then in the field as well, we would just conduct duplicate sampling, which is just placing 2 monitors side by side in the same kitchens. and making sure that the values we get are relatively similar. And again, it was an R squared of 9. This graph is showing in the 8 different countries the fuel breakdown here. And so we tried to oversample in terms of polluting fuels. I mentioned previously there was a lot of fuel switching. So in some countries and some centers in the country, it was hard for them to identify people using polluting fuels. So we tried to make sure we got as many households using polluting fuels so we could actually see the variation between those. And you could just see from this graph how widely it varies. In some cases, it was nearly full use of wood, for example, in Zimbabwe, whereas in China and Bangladesh, we had a wide variety, and that also was dependent on where in China you live. There was multiple different areas in China collected. So then looking at overall across all countries, these were the average concentrations in the kitchen during the 48 hours. And so one of the important things to notice is that WHO has an interim target level, which is what they recommend being at or below this level for health. This is an interim target. Ideally, we want to be at 10 micrograms per meter cubed or below, or 15, but in this case, this is an interim target of 35. You can see that all fuel types, even the cleanest of gas and electric, are above this level. However, having a gas fuel is much lower than using the most polluting fuels like wood, animal dung, and grass. It's a factor of 5 or more. But in a lot of these, and in cases where they're using gas in these low-income countries, there could be other sources of particulate matter as well that are driving that concentration above 35. So then comparing among just households using open fires, or sometimes called the three stone fires. So these are these open fire pits where they cook. So here's a picture from Colombia, Tanzania, and Pakistan. You can see even looking among the same type of stove among the different countries, there was huge variation. So it was a factor of about 4 between Colombia versus Pakistan and Tanzania. So even considering just fuel and stove type, there are huge differences. And so there's other factors as well that can contribute to that difference. And the same will go here for the different types of chimney stoves. You can see they also look very different. So for example, this is a stove made of mud in India. You can see you would actually have exposure to some of the wood and the flames as they're being inserted into the stove. Whereas in this stove in Chile, the wood is fully inside, so lower exposure, which is evidenced by the graph here. And on the right is a chimney stove in China as well. So you can see that Chile, on average, had much lower concentrations from these type of stoves. And then finally looking at gas. So the stove on the left in Chile is something we might consider seeing at stoves here in Canada. But on the right would be an LPG cylinder. So in some countries, they have to buy these tanks, so you consider like a propane tank and cook on those cylinders. And so you can imagine that those exposures could also be different. And a lot of times if they don't have access or cannot get the cylinder, when they run out, they'll revert to using a different type of fuel. They don't have the constant access to the gas fuel. And even among gas stoves, we think, okay, all gas would be clean, but there's still huge variation, a factor of double in South America and Chile and Colombia, and then double that in China and India. So even among gas stoves, there's huge differences. And so referring to fuel stacking, what this is referring to is households using multiple fuels, as I just described. So for example, they may use gas as their primary and wood as their secondary fuel. And the reasons for this can vary. Maybe they like the taste of certain meals cooked on their wood stove, and so they'll use that preparing a big stew, whereas they'll use their LPG just for boiling water and making tea, boiling beans, etc. In some cases, they may like to use their LPG for everything, but they don't have the money to pay for the fuel, so they'll use firewood in some cases. And so the percent of the pure households using multiple fuels varied also substantially. It was over half in India, and then it was also very high in South America and China as well. But then in the African countries as well as the other in South Asia, it was below 10. And so why is that important? Well, looking at our concentrations in the kitchen, I've highlighted in red the 3 certain combinations of stoves. So I have the primary stove is first, and I have an underscore on the secondary stove. So the 3 bars highlighted in red are all use wood as their primary fuel, but different secondary fuels. So wood electricity, so wood as the primary, electricity as a secondary fuel, an average concentration of 46 micrograms per cubic meter, which is close to that of those using gas fuels. Using wood and gas was 80, so slightly higher, but then not using any secondary fuel at all had an exposure double that of 160. So from this graph, it seems like if you're using wood fuel, using the secondary fuel is playing a huge role because you have less amount of time that you're cooking firewood. And that's something that hasn't really been looked at, is collecting information on secondary fuels. A lot of times in surveys, if they're conducting census or health surveys, they'll only collect information on primary fuel, but you can see the secondary fuel can make a huge difference in the concentration as well. And so I've been talking about the concentrations in the kitchen, but now we can actually consider the personal exposures from males and females. And when we consider cooking with polluting fuels and household energy, we normally think of the burden caused by the female, because typically they're traditionally the main cook of households in the low and middle income countries. And if they have young children, they'll be carried on their back or stay in the kitchen with them while they're cooking. And so when we think of exposures, we think, oh, the female and child exposures would generally be higher than those of males because they're the ones doing the cooking and in the same area of the household. And so in the Pure Air study, we collected information on males and females, so we're able to compare those differences across the different countries. Here's a bar graph comparing average male and female exposures by fuel type. Interestingly, for some of the cleaner fuels, there wasn't much difference between the exposures, which is contrary to what you may think in some cases. And so for gas fuels, it was essentially identical. For coal, which is mostly in China, the male exposures are actually higher than the female exposures. That could be indicative of perhaps during the 48 hours, other ambient sources of exposure kind of equating their levels, and so maybe the household air pollution levels do not play as high of a factor there. Whereas the most polluting fuels, you can see there's high uncertainty, but that the female concentrations seem to be much higher than the male concentrations. So there also is variation in the relative difference by fuel type as well. And so we can also calculate average male to female exposure ratios by fuel type. And you can see here that, again, I'm using just the same type of fuel of gas, that there's large variation. So in India, males have an average of 0.8 times the level of females, whereas in Colombia, actually males have 1.5 times that of females. So it's switched in certain countries. And then among using wood fuel, a lot of countries have almost identical exposures. Chile was an outlier with males having much higher exposure, and that could be that the actual ambient environment was much more polluted than the clean gas environment, and so males were outside the house more often, and they actually had higher exposures. So there's a lot of different drivers between these different countries. So I've been talking about particulate matter. Another important... Okay, yeah. Oh, it's on red. It's the battery. Sorry. So for black carbon is important. So when we think of climate change, we think of carbon dioxide, but black carbon is actually a lot more potent than carbon dioxide. It can trap heat in the atmosphere, and it's commonly a source from burning of biomass in households for cooking. That is one of the main sources, in addition to diesel and just open biomass burning in agricultural fields, which is common in India. And so from a climate standpoint and also a health standpoint, EPI studies have looked at black carbon. And so that's something we also want to try to look at from the filters we collected. So not only measuring particulate matter, but also looking at black carbon concentrations. So this is an analysis that was run using the same filters that we collected for the particulate matter. This is also a newer method being used that's quicker and cheaper than other standardized methods. And so you would place the filter in a chamber, and you could just take a picture. In this case, use a Canon camera, but there's also other, you could try with just a simple smartphone and run tests with that, which is, I think, pretty cool. But you have these different gray scales that you can use to calibrate and compare the reflectance, or the amount of light that goes through the filter, compared to those reference categories. And you can kind of do an interpolation to determine the reflectance. And that reflectance is a surrogate measure of black carbon concentrations. And so again, as we compared the UPATs and evaluated that, we can also do a comparison of this image-based reflectance and compare that to other standard methods. You can see there's also high agreement there. So something that I thought was interesting was looking at the black carbon absorbance, or a measure of black carbon by urbanicity. And so these graphs, I plotted all of the kitchen concentrations and looked at it by the travel time to closest densely populated area. So for example, the graph on the left was 0, meaning they are living in a densely populated area, to a 9-minute travel time. And looking at how the relationship between the black carbon absorbance and PM concentration when I stratify by their urbanicity. So those on the upper left are in the most urban areas, as well as on the far bottom right, they're in the most rural. And if you compare the slopes from the two graphs, you can see there's kind of this dose-response relationship almost, where the contribution of black carbon, the slope is much higher in rural areas, meaning that likely that the contribution of their overall concentrations from actual cooking is much higher. So we know that black carbon is found from combustion in households. And so having a higher concentration and a higher slope means that more of the concentrations picked up by the monitors are from the burning of the fuels in household. Whereas a lower slope may mean that other sources are playing a role closer to densely populated areas or more urban areas, which would make sense, meaning that there's probably more ambient air pollution, maybe traffic pollution, other sources contributing to the exposure. So then, finally, to think about how we want to use this data we have on exposures and use that in epidemiological models. Previous work has looked at collecting data from certain countries that I've highlighted here on the left, and looking at predictors of exposure. So we have different primary fuel types, as well as season, urban-rural status, and a measure of SCS. And using this predictive modeling framework, if we have information on these different variables for all countries, we can use this modeling approach to estimate exposures for every country. So that's just a quick summary. And basically, I've showed this graph before, but we use this modeling technique to use data we have from not every country and predict that for all countries. This is done, as I mentioned earlier, to use this approach because we can't collect data in every country. So we're using this modeling technique to leverage survey data that may be available and predict or model exposures. So we have those for every country that cooking with polluting fuels is prevalent. And so for the pure air study, using the same framework, so we have this baseline survey that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. We measured the concentrations in a subset of households, so the 2,500 households. And then in a subset of those, we also have male or female exposures. And so we can build these predictive models using the survey data. So every household that we want to measure in pure, so let's say there's 30,000 households in total in these 10 different countries, and we only have 2,500 measurements. We can actually use the 2,500 and link that to the survey data and have these exposure coefficients from the models. When we have those coefficients, we can link those to the survey data depending on what type of fuel they report, what type of heating fuel, secondary fuel, and we can predict those exposures and develop these models. And we could then have an estimate of a quantitative PM2.5 value for the entire cohort. So basically using the model to scale up our quantitative measurements from 2,500 to 30,000. That way we can increase the power for our epi-analysis. As I mentioned, in the cohort, we have detailed information on during the follow-up period of cardiovascular disease as well as respiratory disease events. And so measuring that or collecting quantitative exposures can help us improve our epidemiological analyses. So some conclusions. So I described that there was a lot of variation, not only by fuel type, but within different countries using the same fuel type. So in addition to that, there's also this type of stoves used, as well as other sources such as ambient, the cooking location, if they're cooking indoors, outdoors, if they have ventilation. And then the difference between male and female exposures in some countries and amongst some fuels was more similar than expected, which was a bit of a surprising finding. As I mentioned, we think of women being having the highest exposure because they're constantly the ones that are doing the cooking traditionally. But in some cases, the male exposures are actually higher or the same than females. And so when we're thinking about the global burden from household air pollution, sometimes if we assume that male concentrations or male exposures, are about half or less than females, then that may in some cases not be correct. And so this study is useful for uncovering those relationships, as well as the differences in in black carbon can show the differences by location. If you're in a more rural area, that may mean that more of your exposure is due to household air pollution versus ambient sources. And then the predictive modeling that I briefly described at the end is just a way for us to mathematically increase the power and sample size of our epi-analyses, since we can't monitor in all 30,000 households. And so then I'm just going to quickly share some of what we provided back to the participants. So going to these countries and collecting their data, it's important to try to provide them something that's meaningful to them that they can understand. Probably giving them the concentration isn't something they understand if we just give them a number of micrograms per meter cubed. So what we tried to do is compare their exposure to the typical range in their community. So in the gray here, I have shaded like the interquartile range, the IQR. We provided charts that were automated that can just compare their level to the level in their community. And so the level would obviously vary between each household. And then we could provide this graph to them, as well as some recommendations on ways that they can reduce their exposure if they don't have access to clean fuels. So, chimney in the household and stay away from trash burning, etc. And so this was uniquely done for each community. And the public health implications. So the pure air study is a way that we can measure these different health outcomes, because we have the comprehensive information from the pure study, which has information on nutrition, and other competing risks that can obviously have an impact on cardiovascular and respiratory health. So we're able to use those and determine the actual or an estimate of the effect of household air pollution on these various health outcomes. And so this large multinational study can improve estimates on a larger scale, and this can be used to improve our estimation in global assessments like the global burden of disease. And this is important because these global burden of disease studies are used by public health, global health stakeholders when they're trying to determine how to use their limited funding to allocate to different environmental risk factors. So you have household air pollution as well as water, sanitation, and various other risk factors. And they only have a certain pot of money. And so having a better estimate of the mortality and morbidity from household air pollution can help determine its ranking relative to other factors. And that can help them determine how to best allocate their limited funding. And that's something that's important from a global health point of view, because that's one of the main sources of funding and intervention research in some cases for these studies. So thank you everyone, and I'm just acknowledging my thesis committee as well as others working on the study, and of course all the Pure Air study investigators. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Matt, to present this enormous amount of work. We have just about 5 minutes to take questions. And I'm going to take a look and see if we have anything from our online audience, give them time to type their questions for us. I'm going to go first. So I was very intrigued by your KT part of your work. And so pure curiosity, how was that received? And when I was looking at the second pamphlet that you had that had more kind of pictograms of what to do, what not to do, my first thought was it all in English? Did you make the effort of actually doing stuff in local languages? And yeah, so what was your experience with that?
Yeah, so for the translation, the field workers would help us translate. So we'd provide that in English, and then they could translate to the local language. And for the pictures as well, we tried to make sure it was locally and culturally appropriate. So we would have the country coordinator and the field workers kind of approve of it and let us know if that's something that's appropriate. And so they would handle that part. So I kind of send them a draft and we'd have a review. And I do this community by community because the template would vary according to country. And in general, from the country coordinators, it was well received. A lot of times they were kind of waiting for these results. That's part of their motivation for doing the study. And so, yeah, I think it was useful for them to see. And a lot of times they may not be aware at all of this being a health issue. And so I think just seeing that and even being a part of the study, it was important. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. That was quite an impressive amount. I like what you described, how you went about to validate your exposure information from country to country. I'm curious about the health outcome data. How did you validate that? You may have mentioned it, but I might have missed it. So.
Yeah, I haven't been working directly with the health outcome data. That I'm working more on the exposure side, and then that will be kind of handed over and done for the epi. So I guess maybe Harry, do you want to talk about that?
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, this is a major challenge with international work. And so they have a whole set adjudication procedure that they do, where they train all the local adjudicators, and then a subset of all events goes to global adjudicators to make sure that there's a standard procedure. And they focus on cardiovascular disease and mortality as like their main outcomes that they adjudicate, and then the respiratory and the other outcomes they use sort of secondary.
Early on in your presentation, you showed some countries changing dramatically. I think it was Indonesia that had a huge increase, moving from dirty fuel to clean fuel. And so I was curious, do you know what it was that Indonesia did? And is it something that's particular about Indonesia? Is that possibly applicable to any of the other countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you're referring to India, and they that country has had a lot of national policy. There's been a lot of national efforts specifically in India to expand access to LPG. They had a lot of programs like Smokeless Village, Give It Up, a lot of nationally funded programs by the National Ministry of Health there. Basically, one of them was to provide the LPG connection to rural households. Free of charge, or in some cases, the LPG subsidy from urban households can be paid back and given to rural households. So that was a huge national push that's given access to millions of households. So I think speculating that that's probably a huge role there, and that may be why in some cases we think that community level factors are more important, because if a whole community is given access to that, that will among the whole community just increase access versus not as important as your within that community, your household status. So that's likely a reason.
Okay, so please join me in thanking very, very warmly Matt for his presentation today.